But first to the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, who joins us from Canberra. Peter Dutton, welcome. John Howard, he took a proposal to recognise Aboriginal people in the preamble to the Constitution back in 1999. Now, that referendum then failed to get any more than 40% of the vote. It got no one state to support it either. 24 years on, Prime Minister Albanese's attempt on the weekend, well, that has failed by a similar margin. And again, not one state supported it. Now, the Voice was a whole lot more than just recognition in the Constitution. I think we can agree on that. But doesn't this say that Australians don't support this push at all?
Well, Peter, I think the Australian public's delivered a very clear verdict, and I think the Prime Minister should listen to that. He apologised in question time today, and obviously he's been completely and utterly focused on the Voice over the course of the last 17 months. And I think a lot of Australians are hurting because of it. They've made decisions economically in two budgets that have driven up the cost of living. So a lot of Australians are very angry about that element of it. To your point, I think in part the message out of the weekend was, one, that Australians aren't opposed to helping Indigenous Australians. I think most Australians instinctively want to make sure that money is being spent effectively and that the programs are being of benefit to people on the ground. Secondly, I don't think they voted against recognition. There's a lot of support for recognition. I think they voted absolutely against the Voice. The Prime Minister took a deliberate decision, unfortunately, from his perspective, not to explain the detail, and I think Australians voted it down, and I just don't think he's across the detail. I think it's sloppy. I think there's an air of incompetence sneaking into, creeping into this government, and I think that's the message that we got out of the weekend.
Yeah, but John Howard's motion in 1999, its referendum then, there was no mention of a Voice. It failed by a similar margin. This one's failed. You currently have on the table the idea that at the next election, if you're elected Prime Minister, you're going to put the same sort of question on referendum, recognition, to the Australian people. Is that going to change out of the result on Saturday night?
There is a policy that we've taken to each election, including the last election, which said that we wanted to recognise Indigenous Australians. Now, I've also been very clear that we don't proceed with that until we know that there is support, bipartisan support from Indigenous leaders. And I think, to be honest, there's fatigue well and truly for referendum. So I don't think there's anything in the near term, but I do think as a policy, it's important to point out we've taken it to subsequent elections. We took it to the last election. It remains our policy. But I make this important point. As I announced on Saturday night, Jacinta and Karen will lead a process for us to review our policies, to call out the rorts and rip-offs within some of the programs, money that's not being spent where it should.
All right, the Prime Minister said the first statement he really made after he won the election was that he was committed to the Uluru Statement in full. I know the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, has said that hasn't changed. That's still Labor's view. So Voice, treaty, truth. Here's the Prime Minister on the question of a treaty today in Question Time.
Is the Prime Minister committed to Makarrata, truth-telling and treaty?
What I'm committed to post the referendum is respecting what Indigenous people have said. Now, the Voice was with constitutional recognition was important. Makarrata is simply a Yolngu word for coming together after struggle. I think it's a good thing that people come together, and I made that very clear on Saturday night that is my position.
Well, Peter Dutton, just like the Voice was a lot more than recognition, Makarrata is a lot more than just coming together. Surely the PM has got to call this dead now.
Well, I mean, surely he does. He committed 34 times to the Uluru Statement in full. He made it clear to the Australian public that that's what he had in mind. Voice was the first step. Now, I mean, you raised the issue of questions asked and answers given. I think the Australian public gave a pretty clear answer to the question on Saturday whether they supported Voice, treaty, truth-telling, Makarrata. I think the Prime Minister would be pretty keen to reject the Australian public's view from the weekend. The treaty talks about a process that can go on for a couple of decades at a cost of literally billions of dollars. The reparations, which is a significant part of what we're talking about as well, I mean, potentially tens of billions of dollars. You've seen the truth-telling, the treaty stuff in Queensland. The Premier there is talking about literally hundreds of millions of dollars just in relation to one element of it, and it's not even started yet. So if that's the case just in Queensland, multiply that across the Commonwealth over decades, you may well be talking about tens of billions of dollars. And the Prime Minister couldn't rule it out. In fact, he just couldn't give a straight answer today. Now, this is going to cause him grief because he's given a private and a public commitment to Marcia Langton and Noel Pearson and others that he will commit to the Uluru Statement in full. And I think this is why many of the Indigenous leaders are angry at the Prime Minister at the moment, because he says different things in different forums. He says one thing in a meeting and gets outside, does a press conference, says the opposite. So I think a lot of Indigenous leaders will be saying, hang on, you signed up to the whole thing and now you're walking away from it.
What about voices per se? You know, there was talk on your side of politics that there'd be some open door to local or regional voices, or perhaps legislated voices, as has been talked about in the past. I mean, given the emphatic result on Saturday night, are you going to put that whole question of a coalition-supported voice of some sort into your review, and are you prepared to look at that again?
Well, it's all in for review, but my view is that the Australian public's been very clear, particularly in relation to, obviously, a voice enshrined in the Constitution. Now, if the Prime Minister wants to go to the next election seeking a mandate for Makarrata, for truth-telling, for everything else that goes with it at the cost of tens of billions of dollars, then that'll be a decision he'll have to make. Whether he proposes to put the voice into legislation, let's wait and see. It wasn't a recommendation of the Marcia Langton report, as we know, but the Prime Minister took that position after he, I think, cowered in the advice of the referendum working group. I think the Prime Minister's trying to please everybody here, just telling different people different things. At some stage, he's got to reconcile the commitments that he's given to the referendum working group, to Noel Pearson and Marcia Langton and Thomas Mayo and others on the one hand, and the Australian people on the other.
Is this an end to the injustice politics, the hatred of Australia Day, the colonisation arguments and all of that? Have we drawn a line in the sand given that result, that emphatic result on Saturday night? And are we now looking in a more focused way, given the billions we spend, is it getting to where it's needed most? And if not, why not? Who is benefiting then from the billions that clearly women and children in particular in remote communities are not seeing?
Well, I certainly hope it is, and I think when you listen to Jacinta Price, she speaks common sense, she can communicate with Australians, and having moved right around the country through Indigenous communities and in capital cities, regional areas, particularly over the course of the last 17 months, I believe the vast majority of Australians are of Jacinta's view and her outlook and perspective. If we just say that there's nothing to see here, the programs are being adequately funded, there's no suggestion of money being diverted away from where it's most needed on the ground, we just condemn ourselves to the same failure of recent years. And if we want to close the gap, as the Prime Minister says, and as we all desire, if we want those educational and health outcomes improved, then we have to start thinking differently. And I think Jacinta can lead the national debate in relation to that. And certainly if we win the next election, Jacinta will be my Minister for Indigenous Australians. And I think that will give our country the best hope of improving the lives of particularly those kids and women who at the moment are suffering because of domestic violence and sexual assaults. We want a better situation for them, and I think it's only Jacinta Price that can deliver that.
Peter Dutton, it's easy to take the tough decisions when they're popular. It's very hard to take them when they're not popular, and that's where I think this debate was when you took the principled decision to oppose the voice for the reasons now we've all ventilated over the last few weeks. So congratulations to you for your principled and conviction stand. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.